Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Islah Jad, for being with us today. We are very excited to have this conversation with you. And thank you to everyone here who's joining us as well. As usual, special thank you to Mosaic Center, Quds Library in Berlin for hosting a live screening of this event. We also appreciate support from Respond Crisis NGO in hosting this event via Zoom. As per usual, we will start today's session with a quick introduction about our group, then about Professor Islah, and after that, we will have a dialogue with the professor, followed by Q&A with questions from the audience. This lecture is co-organized by Student Coalition Berlin in cooperation with the Colonial Research Group, DCOCO. We are a group of students from all disciplines who are both deeply concerned about the unfolding events in Palestine, Israel, and the ongoing discourse and knowledge production about the topic in Germany, or the lack of it for that matter. With us today is Dr. Islah Jad, who is professor and prominent figure in the Palestinian resistance. She lectures on gender and politics in the Women's Studies Institute and Cultural Studies Department at Birzeit University in the West Bank. She's a distinguished scholar renowned for her expertise in gender studies, politics, and social movements. Her last book, Palestinian Women's Activism, Nationalism, Secularism, and Islamism, explores women's movement in Palestine from the 1930s to the post-Oslo period and through the Second Intifada, and against the backdrop of a political landscape marked by internal and as well as all-encompassing Israeli occupation. And now, without any further ado, let's start our conversation. Welcome again, Professor Islah. We have so
Thanks
we have
for
so much
having
me. Our pleasure. We have so much to learn from you about Palestinian context, and we are especially interested in understanding NGOization and what role does the West play in this. But before we get into this deep discussion, I've just mentioned a little glimpse of your career in the introduction. Would you mind sharing more details about your rich life story and career? So who are you? Start and all of the major things and choices.
Thank you, Hanada. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you tonight. To start with, I think the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising that started in 1987 was a turning point for me in the sense that I was always calling for a sort of popular resistance. I mean, in the West Bank and Gaza, militant resistance with armed struggle was most prominent. And most of the population were like passive audience. I mean, the fact that they are residing on their land and steadfast on their land, it is important. But in the meanwhile, I always saw that it is possible to do more to contain the spread of settlements, to do more to show popular and a grassroots movement protest. So the moment came when the first uprising erupted, as I said, in 1987. This is when I saw hundreds of thousands of women took the streets. I remember that I was the first academic from a university to join the ranks of these popular movements. For academics, they saw their role basically in teaching and in supervising research and doing research and writing, but not to take the streets, with the mob, if I can say this. So it was a great moment for me. It made me connect my teaching in the university with what is going on outside the university. And this is when I joined the women's movement in Palestine. That was in 87, 88. The beginning was the fact that I am an academic and I can speak two languages, English and French. So the task at that time by the women's movement was to make speaking tours in Europe and in the US and in different countries to speak about the Intifada and why this particular form of resistance from the Palestinian side. And the speaking tours introduced me to lots of women's activists in the world, in Italy, for example, in France, in Australia, in Canada, in many different places. So the connection was so important to knit ties with the international community and also to speak about the Palestinian situation and what we are struggling for. At that time, lots of delegations, women's delegations coming from all over the world came to visit and be in solidarity with Palestinian women. And I also used to receive these delegations. And we were confronted with the permanent question at that time: what sort of feminism do you defend in Palestine? So the word feminism at that time was a bit, strange for us, because we saw our struggle was basically within the national movement. And from within the national movement, women took lots of space in the society and in the national movement itself. So that led me to do my first writing about what sort of feminism and to trace the continuous struggle of Palestinian women's movement in Palestine, starting from the late 19th century till today. So there was lots of lack of information and knowledge about the movement. How it started, what are its goals, and what are the ways they use to show solidarity with the cause of their people. So that was I published my first article in 1990. And since then, I focused all my research and work on the evolution and the different, the different forms of Palestinian women's movements, whether in its secular form or in its Islamist form. And here I am here.
It's very, very interesting. And I think one thing that resonates with us here is what you mentioned about being the first academic to join, because it feels like it's a common sentiment for academics to separate themselves from the grassroots movement. I think you can tell you in Europe that it's not as common, like here. Can you hear me?
There were some interruption. Could you repeat your question again, please?
Yeah. Now is it better?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I was just saying this sentiment in relation to academics joining popular movements is not common. So when you mentioned it, it was very interesting for us, and so to be both an activist and academic is not, unfortunately, as common. For us today here, we also feel the same. We feel kind of segregation. It's not so common for academics, but I think, which that takes me to the second question, again, about general situation before we talk about NGOization. I want to speak about academics and students in Palestine today. Could you tell us a little bit about the situation for students in Palestine in general and the West Bank in specific. What does it mean to be an educator, or a student in the West Bank? Do they have a choice to not join anymore? Yeah, so an overall description and how it changed, just for us as students here to be better aware of what is going on in Palestine, would be really appreciated.
Yeah. Well, to give you an overview about higher education in general in Palestine, but also about education in general, as all other means, education and targeting in educational institutions was one of the tools that the Israeli used to destroy the Palestinian society. We are talking here about around 17 institutions of higher education in Gaza. We have the six big universities, in addition to 2 open education universities in Gaza. So we are talking about 8, and about 5 colleges, university colleges, and 6 community colleges. Most of these institutions were destroyed in this war on Gaza after October 7. In the West Bank, we have like 13 universities. If I talk about Birzeit itself, we are talking about 15,000 students at Birzeit University that was established in 1924. It was started as a girls' school, turned into a college in 42, then a university in 72. An-Najah University was established in 1918, and Beit Lahem University was established in 1972, etc. So one of the reasons the universities were permitted in the West Bank and Gaza, that was under Shimon Peres, the prime minister, the Israeli prime minister, because before that, universities were not allowed by the military governor. And the reason Peres allowed the establishment of university, as he wrote in his memoir, saying that this will ease the formation of white collars in the occupied territories, which will ease later on to leave the country and go looking for work abroad, because the Palestinian economy is so limited and so much controlled by the Israelis, and job opportunities are very limited. So the thinking that having higher education will ease the immigration outside of the country was something very tempting for the Israeli government at that time. And of course, it was quickly proved wrong, because higher education institutions started to form hubs for people coming together from all parts of the occupied territories, from Gaza, north of West Bank, south of West Bank, from Jerusalem, from all over the place, which intensified and developed a lot a sense of collectiveness among the students and students' community. And quickly, universities turned into a hub for protest and systematic and active policy against the occupation. So that's why the separation at the beginning between academics and the students' bodies, because most of the activism used to take place in schools and in universities. So it was seen as activism for youth and younger generation, and not for educators or for teachers. Besides, the punishment for the teachers and educators was, of course, harsher than against the students at that time. But to give you an overview about the status and the conditions around this university, we are talking, for example, in the West Bank about 700 roadblocks and barriers. And these roadblocks, of course, controlled by the army. So if a student coming from the north or the south or from Jerusalem, each city and each village has a roadblock. So sometimes it takes very long time to reach the university, and after they reach the university, most of the classes, they miss most of the classes. And these roadblocks were used extensively starting from the first Palestinian uprising in 1987. For example, in my university, there was a huge roadblock that it used to start at 7:30 in the morning, and they leave it in the afternoon. That means that most of the classes, the students will miss most of the classes. And after the first uprising, all universities and higher education institutions were shut down by a military order for 4 years. 4 years, we were teaching our students in mosques, in churches, in our homes, in public places. And the same thing happened for schools. They closed all schools, including kindergartens, for 2 years and a half. So imagine yourself having 2-3 kids in front of you without any sort of education for 2 years and a half. And why they did so? This is again was used as a tool to kick people out, because no one, can really accept the idea to see their kids in their homes without education for 2 years and a half. So at that time, many of us as teachers, we formed what we called it at that time popular committees. The popular committees basically to continue education as I said, in our homes and in different places outside of the campus or the institution of schools or universities. So we can say that all the educational process is controlled by the Israelis. For example, at Birzeit University, our president, Dr. Hanna Nasser, at that time, as I said, the university was established and opened as a university in 1972. In 1974, the first president was deported outside occupied territories. When I say deported, I mean he was kicked out of the West Bank, and he returned after 19 years. So the Israeli authority controls, who can permitted to teach at Birzeit, because some of the teachers, they come from abroad, from Europe, Palestinians, of course, or foreigners, but, with foreign passports. As you, Hanada, for example, if you have a German passport, we wish, for example, to invite you to teach. So the Israelis have to give you a permission to come. So most of the time they give a permission for 1 month to 3 months. And then they start harassing the teachers to leave the country. And of course, by this way, they control completely who can come and teach and who cannot come. Our books, when we buy our books, they are also controlled. Some of the books don't enter the country, or they leave it on the ports for years till it gets ruined. I remember, for example, I was in Egypt and I bought an Egyptian magazine called Hawa at that time, and they confiscated all the issues I brought with me, and I didn't receive them till now. And I'm talking about after almost 18 years from the time they took these magazines. With the separation of the West Bank from the Gaza Strip and from Jerusalem, we used to have almost a third of our students coming from Gaza, but with the closures and the separation between West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, the number of the Gaza student in 2005 dropped to 35 only. And now we have very few students, from Gaza. And of course, we are talking about some old students. The new ones, they don't come. We have, for example, in the Women's Studies Institute, we have master's students from Gaza. They couldn't graduate till now since 2003. This is when they completely separated West Bank from Gaza. And the same, of course, for students from Jerusalem. We can say also that over the years, Israel vetoed Palestinian books at universities under the title of inappropriate books, which basically dealt with the Palestinian narrative of their history. This also extends itself to schools' textbooks, whereby, for example, the EU changed its position, and all Palestinian curriculum is so much monitored by Israeli government and also by European governments who used to fund the establishment and the development of Palestinian curriculum. If I talk about direct harassment against the university, I could say that to date, for example, 30 Beer State University students were murdered by the Israeli occupation, whether inside, mostly outside the campus. But on November 29th, 2022, the two brothers, Dhafar and Jawad al-Rimawi, were murdered by the Israeli forces. This comes weeks after student Amr Halabiya was also killed. I can speak about the number of students who were in prison or till now in prison, about the continuous harassment of the student council and the confiscation of materials students use in their activities inside the university. And of course, now we are talking about Gaza, where all the schools are targeted, and most of the schools that transformed into shelters to shelter the displaced. And as you know, as I said before, all universities were targeted by bombardment and were destroyed. Their equipments were looted or also put on fire. And now you have more than 650,000 students in Gaza are left without any sort of education. So this is the bleak image now.
Honestly speaking, I think, and maybe later we would hear more from my colleagues, other friends in Berlin universities. I think we can always hear so much about what is happening, but it's astonishing every time you hear it. And I think maybe at the end of our conversation today, you could tell us more a little about what we could do better to contribute. But I'll not because just to go back to the focus of our discussion today, and because it's important to understand how the Western influence doesn't only come in the form of military support to Israel or other weird forms of support. There is this their role in the on impacting the social movements. So I want to dig deeper into the term NGOization. And I know from a little bit of a quick survey that I did that it's not a very common term. So it's commonly used by many social movement activist workers and academic, the term NGOization, to refer to institutionalization and professionalization and depoliticization of social movements. And you academically have written about deconstructing the development discourse in relation to NGOization. Would you please break down the term for us? How did it materialize in the Palestinian case, particularly when it comes to the intersectionality of gender and colonization?
Very good. Usually, when I come to supervise a thesis for a master's students or a PhD students, and we discuss what sort of argument they want to develop through their research, I always advise to start with, you know, a kind of astonishing observation, to be observant, and something, you know, that struck you and makes you feel like you want to know why this happened. So this moment came to me before my research when I started to notice that the activists I used to be with after the first uprising, and the faces I knew, and the form of activities we used to do were gradually, you know, disappearing, to be replaced by new faces, by new form of organization, and by new agendas. And I was so astonished to notice that. And I wanted to know what happened and why, you know. And for example, during the uprising and before the uprising, we used to be, as women's movement, a very grassroots movement. I mean, a movement that broke the divide between urban centers and rural areas, between urban centers and refugee camps. And it was a form of organization that was open for all women, you know, coming from all walks of life. And it was really democratic, you know, very direct democracy for electing the leaders, for discussing the objectives and the forms of resistance, and etc. So that was the form, a form of open doors, grassroots organizations. The move was toward an NGO. And on an NGO, it means that you have an office, you have a staff, you have a confining form of organization, not open for every woman, because you have in an NGO, if you register as an NGO, it means that you have like a general assembly, you have a board of trustees, you have administrative staff, and you have an executive director. This form is not open for all women. It's open for certain women. And the fact that the move from the kind of internal dynamics within a grassroots movement, we used to do lots of, you know, very simple things to collect money, to cook a popular dish, for example, and sell it, to do jam, to do any sort of, to open kindergartens, to open a cooperative. I mean, simple projects, you know, to increase our financial resources. And most of the work used to be done on voluntary basis. All the work I invested many years of my life just doing voluntary work until now, by the way. But, you know, in an NGO, if you want to do anything, you have to pay. You know, you have to pay the staff first. And in our grassroots organization, we were not paid. We were not paid for any work we were doing. But in NGO, you have to pay the staff. And if you want to do a research, you have to pay. If you want to do a training, you have to pay. So they were very much relying on funding, you know, outside the organization, not collecting, be self-reliant in your own funding. And the fact that you are self-reliant, it gives you lots of liberty in deciding what you want to do and what form of activism you want to conduct. But the fact that you are becoming now reliant on foreign funding or international organization quickly, funding comes with ideas. It's never innocent, you know? So this is when we saw the move from, you know, the struggle for national liberation into the struggle for women's rights, as if, you know, there is an independent state and we are finished or done with the occupation, and now we have a state that we need to reclaim our rights from. And the full adoption of CEDAW, it's the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and all universal conventions related, you know, to women's rights, children's rights, etc., etc. And this is, you know, was very misleading in the sense that we didn't have really a state. We are not till now independent. The authority or the state does not control any of its resources. The state, the so-called state, cannot decide who is a Palestinian. For example, you have Palestinians who live, who are refugees, who live outside of Palestine. They are given Palestinian passport where they can use it everywhere in the world, but not to Palestine. Why? Because who decides who is the Palestinian is not the Palestinian Authority, it's Israel. If Israel doesn't grant you the right to reside on the Palestinian land, you cannot enter this land. So as I started, NGOization here is a process that took place to change the form of organizations, the type of agenda, the objectives, the form of resources you used to take, and quickly, you know, the very poor looking women, they used to come to tell me about the activities, where to meet and in what places. They were pushed aside, and then we saw the scene is overwhelmed by technocrats or femocrats, women, you know, in the bureaucracy of NGOs, begging the international community to protect Palestinian rights, Palestinian women's rights or children's rights, and documenting, writing reports, and of course they left the streets. They became all in offices, documenting and writing reports to all international apparatuses, and you know, the great struggle was in the corridors of these international organizations and not in the streets.
Yeah, yes, but I actually, so I worked interestingly in NGOs for a while in the Syrian context, and we did. So when you mentioned that, like when we were discussing the topic, and then NGOization came along, I was like, this rings a bell, because you mentioned the shift and how that influenced the movement, but what about NGOization as a tool for changing the social movement in a way, especially when it comes to what is the focus of the NGOs in general, was that also something that because Palestine are more expert than Syria in the NGO sector. You guys have been there for so many years. You've lived it all before us. We just in the Syria context, after the revolution, we started living a similar experience in a way, because we were not experienced. There was a social movement that started, and then all of a sudden we started feeling this pressure to earn a living and then organize in NGOs, and then we started receiving suggestions on what has that been. Could you tell us more about the Palestinian experience? I'm going to come in a later question about women liberation and stuff. I want to ask it in its own question, because I think that deserves its own focus. But generally speaking, how was that a thing where West used the NGOization for influence? And could you tell us more about it?
First of all, NGOs attracted lots of women's activists and activists in general, whether men or women. And of course, the fact they left their organizations, grassroots organizations, and moved into NGOs to be paid, that weakened the activism on the grassroots level, because the NGOs took lots of their qualified and popular leaders that were formed in the streets during the struggle. So this is number one. Number two, as I said, money comes with ideas, and the ideas that came with money moved, all the attention into some sort of, liberal kind of agendas about defending rights. And also, for example, put lots of emphasis and locus on issues related to domestic violence and, gender equality. And here, for example, issues like domestic violence was so completely disconnected from the overall violence that we live in. So imagine now you are in Gaza, and women, they lost their homes, they lost their families, they lost their children, they lost their education, they lost their work, and you come to ask her, does your husband beat you? It becomes irrelevant, because the general context of violence we live in is so overwhelming. So these ideas or these agendas diverted the attention from the main source of oppression in the Palestinian context into, a very, very, I would say, and I don't want to say secondary source of oppression, but very much connected to the overall frame of oppression women used to live in. So besides, after adopting these liberal feminist agendas and liberal, ideologies in general about, individual rights and liberties, etc., and now, and not now, but since almost now 10 years, the donors started to put conditions that if you want to receive funding, you have to sign a statement saying that you denounce terrorism. And what is terrorism in our context is when you resist, but by all means, the Israeli occupation. And here you have to guarantee and sign on a statement that the funding will not be used in any way to celebrate terrorism or to support terrorism. In that sense, they wanted us, or they wanted the heads or the directors of the NGOs to be like, a surveying body on their own population, to know if they give them support, what sort of of support, what they will do with this support, you know. So, for example, an organization that was supported by the UN Women took, you know, a small grant to do something for women. But the same organization built a monument to commemorate Dalal al-Mughrabi as a Palestinian freedom fighter in a public square in the north of Palestine. So the organization was accused by the Israeli NGO monitor that UN Women is supporting a terrorist organization that is commemorizing a terrorist person that was killed by the Israeli army at that time, which is Dalal al-Mughrabi. And, you know, it was horrible. The Palestinian employee who gave the grant for this organization was forced to resign, and they made a big scandal out of this incident. So they started to put conditions that we have, if we receive money, we have to sign this statement. And by the time they started to tighten the grip, you know, on the internal management of the organization, to make sure that they don't have any adverse discourse, you know, on Israel, or any violent attitude again. To summarize, the money that used to be paid started to be paid with lots of conditions that it transforms you into a completely apolitical organization, as if you live in Switzerland in a very neutral context, and you should not deal in any effective way with the struggle of your people, in order to prove that you are neutral and you are not adopting or adhering to any adversary discourse against your occupiers, which is becoming ridiculous, of course. So this kind of transformation was so important, of course, you know, to be aware of. And of course, we since then, we are struggling a lot within the EU to urge the EU to cancel this clause from any funding to Palestinian organization, because of this clause, Israel accused the biggest 6 human rights organizations in Palestine by being a terrorist organization. You see, so the organization themselves are accused now as terrorists by the Israeli government, using this European Parliament clause in their funding.
Before I move to the questions from our friends here, I wanna go to the women liberation and the Western vision for you know, liberty and democratization, etc. And again, I think we've witnessed something. We witnessed in the Syrian context something similar to what you said. Speak about women against violence, but as long as it's the violence we want to stand against, you cannot define all the violence. It should be the violence that meets our political agenda. And you mentioned a few examples in this regard. However, I've still, and despite this and despite the list, the women movement in Palestine still survived. I don't know if I can say thrived, but it's managed to stay relatively strong despite endless amount of obstacles, one by one. Since you joined it quite early on and you're still on board until today, how did the women movement manage to stay strong, stay until today? And what do you think lessons we should learn from it? I would say in other Arab regions, but also for all the women listening today.
Well, the first lesson is that women's issues, are never separated from the general context in the country we live in. Women's issues are very political issues. They are not, something docile, sweet, that you can, leave a despotic regime lives in peace and happily, and you have your corner to struggle for women's rights without, any intervention or any interference in the general context in which you live. This is number one. So women's issues are very political issues. And why they are very political issues? Because if a government decides, for example, privatization of education or health or public services, women are the first to bear the brunt of such policies. If you have a despotic regime and lots of men are in prison, women are bearing the brunt of this imprisonment, their children and their own, personal life. If, for example, a government is not supporting properly public service and you have a declining transportation system, women will bear the brunt, of sexual harassment in public transportation, or has to pay more money to get, taxis or whatever. So any public policy in a country, women are very much affected by it. So it's not only the question of, the Sharia and the laws. It's not only that. Laws are important, but also other policies, social, economic, political, are also important. When a government supports, for example, in order to control religious groups, supports the dissemination of, very delusionist kind of religion that is putting the emphasis on rituals, but not on moral values, for example. This culture affects women. It affects women in the sense that women should they have to conform with this, this kind of formal or ritualistic religion, that the most important thing is to put the veil, is not to show her body, not to, they forget the essence of the religion, which is with its basic moral values, and put the emphasis on, on rituals or on symbols that have nothing to do with the religion. So if this is the cultural policy of a country, women are, of course, affected by it to a great deal, exactly like what happened in Egypt. In order for the government to control the regime, to control the population, all public media was so much full with religious leaders saying nonsense about women and about religion, and it's because the purpose was not to change the people, the purpose was to control the people. And who paid the price for this kind of nonsense? It was basically women. And, the restrictions on their mobility and their way of dressing and way of talking, and et cetera, et cetera.
I will go now to the first question. We've got actually lots of Americans in our universities. So I think this is where the question is coming from. So the question reads, how does funding from Palestinian NGOs coming from America shape the dynamic? America is obviously responsible for supporting Israel in many ways. So how does their influence on the Palestinian NGO sector shape goals, horizons, and perspectives?
With the American funding?
Yes, because I don't know for the Palestinian case, for the Syria case, the biggest sums of money were the ones coming from the Americans, and the biggest decisions were also coming from the Americans.
Of course, in the Palestinian context, we had the US aid. And US aid, I can tell that it was the worst funder in the sense that it abides fully by the Israeli agenda. For example, Israel divided the Palestinian West Bank territory into 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. Area A is basically the center of urban centers, big cities like Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jenin, etc. Area B is controlled by the Palestinian Authority when it comes to social policies and education and stuff like this. But when it comes to security, it is shared by Israel in Area B. And Area C, which represents 60% of the land of the West Bank, or 62% of the land of the West Bank, where you have scattered villages, and most of the settlements are on this area. The Palestinian Authority has no say in this area. They have nothing to do. It's fully under the total control of Israel. So, for example, US aid, Israel does not encourage any international donor to invest in any project in Area C. And why is that? Because they put their eye on it to confiscate it for the Jewish settlements, So US aid abide by this policy. It doesn't resist it. This is number one. Number two, when Donald Trump came to power during his term, he closed down all US aid offices in the West Bank and Gaza. And all Palestinian staff were working in this agency, they were kicked out. US aid was the first to apply the anti-terrorist clause. That we have to abide by signing a statement, an anti-terrorist statement. So the most 90% or 95% of Palestinian civil society sector and organizations, they are boycotting US aid. They don't deal with US aid. And it is a shame to receive money from US aid. As an NGO, as a respectable NGO, you should not receive money from US aid, because we all know the kind of conditions they put on the recipients of their funding. Besides, it depends on the political mood in the office, in the prime office in America. If Trump arrives to power again tomorrow, we will face the same problem. After Trump, US aid is trying to come back to its usual activism in the West Bank, but people are very skeptical because they know that it is not a reliable or a stable funder, and it has lots of heavy political agenda.
I think this connects well to the second question from some of the audience, again from an American friend who also studies here, but I think it's the dilemma that you would face as an activist, which is, so I will read the question. Although it's true that the grassroots organizations has more political freedom to act and speak, it's also difficult to maintain a long-term activity as they are done on their free time of people, while they need to go on their works, family and personal activities, etc. So activists are then faced with the problem of facing these unacceptable compromises, like signing clauses that forbid us to do activities on solidarities with Palestine in Germany, for example, or suffering burnout, or just being unable to go on with these activities. Do you think there is a way of solving this problem or avoiding it?
Well, actually, many misunderstood my argument about the NGOization. And yes, I voiced a very strong opposition to this process of NGOization and the transformation from a grassroots movement into an NGO. So my focus was on the negative impacts of a grassroots movement to move into an NGO. This doesn't mean that all NGOs are bad. What I saw as important role, or what I see as an important role for an NGO, is to be a catalyst for a social movement. NGOs can be very efficient in importing creative ideas, in disseminating creative ideas, in pooling resources, in facilitating, communication or publications. They have lots of things to do, but in support of a social movement, in support of it, not to replace it. You see the difference? So if there is this division of role between grassroots movement and NGOs, I think the result will be very important, because yes, the grassroots movement takes time. It is daunting work. You have to be very much committed to the continuation, and to waste sometimes in long discussions and conflicts and etc. So unless you have a very clear and you are so committed to a political objective, it is so hard to be in a grassroots movement. You see what I mean? And the fact that if an NGO serves as a catalyst, as I said, the NGO could, could channel some resources, for example, for NGO, for a grassroots movement, can amplify its voice, can guide it to what form of lobbying might be more efficient. What are the most corrupt politicians to avoid? Who can link your activism to make an influence? NGOs can do this role, as I said, to be a catalyst, but not to be not to replace a grassroots movement. They cannot replace it, and they cannot take a daring political position as a grassroots movement can take. Because the first thing, if they dare to go in opposition to the political regime, it is very easy to shut down their offices and to arrest their staff. But with a grassroots movement, they cannot do that. Yes, they can put in prison 5, 10, 20, but they cannot put thousands of people in the same time. They cannot put them in prison. So this popular power in the street is so important to make a change,
Yeah.
and the NGO cannot do this. The NGO cannot have this power in the street. Grassroots movement can have it, but not an NGO.
Yes, I totally I see this point, and I think I want to build on what you're saying, but looking in terms of solutions on how can you still help social movements rise, because after the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza started becoming worse and worse, we saw, I think, at least from the outside, and I think maybe in Palestine, so we saw a new movement happening globally empowered by social media, which is a whole new different level of things. I think, again, there's the new generation and all over the world have been using it. But what we have, and again, I'm assuming we're seeing here in this case, is a whole revitalization of the Palestinian cause after Israel tried to bury it for so long. Can we look at this situation? First of all, how big do you think this change is, or this online movement is? And do you see it as an opportunity for long-term not solution, for revitalization of the Palestine question?
Yes, I think this situation is so important in the sense that it's genuinely a grassroots movement driven by a deep sense of justice, because we saw all the conventions, all the universal conventions for the protection of human rights, or international humanitarian rights. They were so much manipulated by governments, and the proof that we saw 5 vetoes in the Security Council in the UN that America used to veto a ceasefire in Gaza, and everyone say that it's a genocide, including the International Court of Justice. However, UN as an apparatus to achieve justice was so paralyzed by the politics of the different governments represented in the Security Council. You see, all UN other organizations, UNRWA, WHO, UNICEF, name it, World Food Organization, just name it, they were all paralyzed, and they could not implement what it exists in their own conventions, about the right to education with UNICEF, about the right to save your life in the WHO, or the right to have a medical aid. Everything was ruined. Hospitals were attacked. Ambulances were targeted. Medics were killed, with no organization, claiming, holding an agenda of the protection of any sort of human rights without being able to do anything. You see, who took the streets and saw these flagrant forms of injustice? People like me and you, they were driven by this deep sense of justice that took to the streets, and that this is unjust, this is a genocide. And thanks to the social media, thanks to the BDS movement, thanks to many youth movements in the West, in America, thanks to conscious and, ethical Jewish groups in America and in Europe, all this played together, to see all these millions of people, in the streets. This is a very important form of protest and very important form of organization to show that we are not happy with the paralysis of the UN system that is controlled by the political will of the Western governments. This has to be translated into a voting power, whether in America or in Europe. This is the political meaning of our activism in the streets, to transform it into a change within our own countries, to support those who took an ethical stand to safeguard justice and, calling for fairness and equality. And for those who took the stand of their, the stand of the Israeli government and the blind support for Israel in supporting Israel in committing this terrible genocide that is taking place now in Gaza. And by the way, it's not only in Gaza. In the West Bank, the situation is not better. Since October 7, Israel killed in the West Bank more than 400 Palestinians. But the people are not paying attention because all the attention is on the slaughterhouse in Gaza. But in the West Bank, settler violence is unbelievable. Just yesterday, they entered a village of Burin in the north of the West Bank, and they put fire in the houses, they burn cars, they shoot at people. Every day, Palestinians are killed also in the West Bank. Today, 2 were killed. 2 Palestinians were killed, So those who are supporting these policies, the Israeli policies, they should be accountable to their stand through our voting in the elections.
I think what you just about the West Bank, I think for as a viewer, also as a person who's trying to follow up, I think people know a little bit about what's happening in the West Bank. The problem is, as you mentioned, it's just the level of atrocity is just unbelievable. Like whenever you think it's bad, it cannot be any worse. You find a new level of crimes that it's just extremely unbelievable. And I think this is what also is contributing to this drive on social media. We are in shock. We can't believe that this is allowed to happen. I'll go now just to another question, again in relation to donors, and I think what we are trying to do here is also to understand, find solutions. So Callum is asking, how big is the role of private donors? Does this allow any different kind of space to maneuver in? And I think, yeah, go ahead. I would ask if it's not only in Palestine, but also for supporting Palestine outside. We see this happening now, like private crowdfunding, private donation happening. What do you think about it?
Well, let us go back to the history in our area, and if you go back to the history in our area based on our own Islamic civilization in the past, you will see that most of the hospitals, mosques, katatib, or religious schools, sabils, it's a water source, built water source for the passing by to drink fresh water. All these kind of things were done by private donations. People used to donate their private properties to Al-Awqaf institution. It's the religious waqf, So it is not something strange for us to donate. People used to donate, women used to donate their gold when their countries were confronted by famine or by wars. If I mention the famous singer Kulthum, after the Israeli war in 1967, she made the first time a tour outside of Egypt, because all Arabs used to come to listen to hear her voice in Egypt. But to contribute to the efforts to rebuild the Egyptian army at that time, she decided to make a tour, and she collected lots of donation geared to the to the Egyptian army at that time. So donation and giving for charity work is something deeply rooted in our culture. So this is one thing. And I give another example of my own university. My own university, 90% of the buildings of my university are private donation from expatriate Palestinians. The library donated by a wealthy Kuwaiti, engineering faculty by a Palestinian, health clinic but by a Palestinian, a media college by a Palestinian, nursing college by a Palestinian expatriate. So lots of wealthy Palestinians in the diaspora donated lots of money for many projects. And we have the Welfare Association. The Welfare Association is funded by rich Palestinian expatriates to do projects in the West Bank and Gaza. So I think private donation is so important to avoid the political conditions that I spoke about, you know, from international donors. And now, for example, in Gaza, I know of at least two initiatives. One initiative through a charitable association called the Rehabilitation of the Family, or Inash al-Usra in Ramallah, where they will adopt 5,000 Palestinian Gazans orphans out of these war children. And lots of people donate money for this important initiative. And another initiative is to offer like collective kitchen in different areas in Gaza to feed people. You know, we saw these airdrops that killed 6 Palestinians so far. And yesterday, it suffocated one Palestinian. The parachute turned, you know, the thread around its neck, and he was instantly killed amid the crowd of people rushing, you know, to take some of the aids. So to offer the food not in this showy Hollywoodian style, to offer food with dignity is so important. And this is another initiative that is taken by a wealthy Palestinian here in the West Bank.
I really, I was telling my friends, I really like this question. I think, again, coming from NGO background, I kind of was brainwashed into focusing on the idea of funding coming from states, while actually it's true in our culture, giving is a key element, and I think it's very important to bear that in mind going forward. The next question is from Ali. How do you see that many NGOs are taking stance against Israel, putting at risk their own funding? Is that a new development in your perception? And do you think this will have a consequence? I think whether it's positive or negative, yeah.
Let me tell you first that lots of NGOs, especially human rights NGOs, are so much disappointed by international organizations claiming human rights, because many of them, they took the stand at the beginning of Israel, and they equated Israelis with Palestinians, and they took October 7 as the starting point, and they ignored many you know, decades of oppression against the Palestinians that led to many uprisings, many confrontations before. So all international organizations took this stand, or equating, you know, occupied with occupiers. People are very now critical and skeptical of these organizations. And there are lots of, you know, debates, internal debates within the civil society organizations about refusing completely this equation, and also refusing any sort of conditional funding. And many are, of course, suffering, including my own university, because of the lack of funding. But you know, this will be maybe beneficial to find some other ways to you know, to continue with the work. For example, in my institute, we decided to do a sort of university-to-university cooperation. I mean, to take, funding from universities, doing joint projects, joint research, joint initiatives, but not from governments, with the political conditions I spoke about. So this kind of cooperation between the people like-minded, this is very important to evade the conditions, the political conditions put by donors.
It's actually quite interesting. There's your field of expertise is very broad, yet also has lots of specificities in it that it's hard to just. I have so many questions. So, but the next question before I ask you my final question is not directly connected to what we've been discussing, but it's I heard a video, an audio or a podcast of you, and it really I found it very, very interesting. So I wanted to ask you about it, although I'm drifting a little bit far away from the topic. So in one of the interviews, you mentioned something about how Israel's is actually contributing to empower and enhance certain Islamist narratives, particularly those that are not in support of women's rights. I don't know if I'm framing, and Israel has been doing that through its colonial and apartheid practices. I don't know if I'm rephrasing what you said correctly, but can you comment on this idea, how Israel is negatively impacting women's rights in general also?
Well, through different mediums. First of all, if we take what are the sectors women used to work in, we will find that agriculture is the most sector, attracting women. Palestine is it's a rural country. And people in the past used to live on their agriculture, whether wheat, grains, olive trees, or whatever. So, by controlling the land and kicking the people out, it means that most of women lose their jobs. And with the loss of their jobs, they lost their status, because working in your land, bringing income, and participating actively in earning, in earning an outcome for your family, it gives you a status. So this is number one, that they control the source of income and the source of status for women. Number two, Israelis, as they do now in Gaza, they don't want the Hamas authority in Gaza. But what did they do? They went to look for tribes, heads, for traditional leaders. Why is that? Because they are very Orientalist. They cannot see any modern social structure for the Palestinian. The fact that we have the highest level of education in the Middle East, the highest level, the enrollment rate at the elementary stage for female is almost 99%. It is the highest in the Arab world. The holders of PhD in Palestine compared to the number of population is the highest in the Arab world, etc., etc. So they don't want to see us as, a modern society with educators and educated people, with women working, etc. No, they want to see us as a traditional society governed by traditional leaders, divided not as a national unity or a people with national aspirations, but as divided by families and tribes. So now they look in Gaza, they look for traditional leaders to take place instead of Hamas. The leaders in Hamas are mostly holding PhDs, they are well educated, they run universities. This is not acceptable for Israel. They have to look for traditional leaders. In the same token, they participated a lot in activating Palestinian patriarchy. In what way? In many ways. For example, after 1967, when they used to arrest women activists, the first thing they ask a woman in the prison is to completely take off her clothes. Why? Because, showing your body as an Arab and Muslim woman is not socially acceptable. It's shameful. We don't show our bodies, to the public. This is not in our culture, So yes, you can see people revealing big parts of their bodies in the streets in Europe. It's not here. It's not in our culture. Not only for women and men. It's rarely, you can rarely see a man, going to an office with a short, for example, as in America or in Europe. It's not your body, it's so private and you don't show it to the public. So anyhow, so by activating, patriarchy, so they wanted to shame women through shaming their body in the prison. In Gaza, there are some horrific reports, recent reports done by Israeli NGOs and some Palestinian NGOs and international NGOs that spoke about 112 cases of rape in Israeli prison. About 13 cases of collective rape in Israeli prisons. About 3 cases got pregnant and they have to be in a shelter, in the West Bank. So why they are doing exactly as what happened in Abu Ghraib in Iraq? It's to shame the honor of the family, to activate patriarchy, to punish these women. But to their, bad luck, instead of shaming women, the people and the political organization glorified these women. They saw them as national leaders. Yani the first Palestinian woman spoke about this kind of sexual harassment in a prison, in Israeli prison. It was in 1968. In a court, in a military court in Nablus, which is a traditional city compared to Bethlehem or Ramallah, for example. She spoke publicly in details about what they did to her in the prison. It is to shame them, not to feel herself ashamed. So saying always that Israel was an important agent for modernizing Palestinian women and open the labor market for Palestinian, it's nonsense. It's nonsense because the labor market for a Palestinian woman was basically it's her land that was confiscated. And secondly, the economy that is completely controlled by the Israeli economy. My son runs a small private business in delivering food. Once the small company started to take off, a huge Israeli company came to compete in the market. Why? Because we have an open market. And name it, just, name it on any other thing. If you cultivate onion, you will see the settlements are spreading their onion product in our market, banana, apple, everything. We have no protection of our economy. and we cannot have direct connection to any big technology companies. Any big company, we have to go through an Israeli intermediate, but not directly to the Palestinian land. So we have a very controlled economy. We cannot control our land, and the possibility to create job in our market is so limited. You see, so when they ruined our livelihood, when they ruined our economy, and they say that we open our labor market for women to liberated from their families, and in the same time they support and revive by all means and ways the patriarchy, the traditional tribal structure. So it's again one of the Israeli Haspara we are very familiar with, spreading lies and doing the opposite exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like over so many years, Israel got extremely creative on how to break the laws, like all type of laws. It has been, the conversation with you was really very, very informative. And as we reach the end of our conversation, I want to ask you a last question or a statement from you to students in Europe who are pro-Palestinian, or those who do not have a position on the situation. How can we as students support the Palestinian cause? What can we, I don't know if you have an idea, that the students here have been doing lots of protesting, they're organizing events. What else can we do, and what do you think we should focus on going forward?
I think the most important thing is to sanction Israel. Look at Joseph Borrell, that we come to plead Israel, please don't do that, please don't do this. No, it doesn't work with this. Sanction Israel. BDS is so important in this respect, exactly as the apartheid system in South Africa. This is number one. Number two, any joint initiatives with Palestinian institutions is so important. This is again to evade the conditioned, funding coming from big international donors. Third, if you have any doubt about the Palestinian narrative and the just, cause of the Palestinians, please come and visit and see with your own eyes. Come and see with your own eyes, because the reality on the ground, it's much grimmer than you see it on the social media, or even I will not speak about the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is really horrible. So use the social media, and if you have any doubts about anything, come and visit and see yourself and judge after that.
That's very valuable. Thank you so much. And then I think with this we can wrap up our session. I cannot thank you enough so much, Professor Islah. This has been extremely informative. And I'm sorry it's getting late for you, but
and it will be a great pleasure to meet you in person one day, to come and visit here.
I wish, but as a holder of the Syrian passport, it cannot get any worse. But I would love to, and I think lots of people would love to. Our friends are sending their regards in the chat. I will stop the recording now.